In this episode, we speak with Matt Engel, the founder and CEO of Paradromics, whose interface platform records brain activity at the highest possible resolution, the individual neuron. Paradromics technology aims to help millions with unmet medical needs suffering from paralysis and movement disorders to chronic pain, addiction, depression, and other mental health conditions. Its AI algorithms decode massive amounts of brain data, enabling the seamless translation of thought into treatments. I'm your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow.
RJ Lumba is the executive chairman of Market Insight Media and the managing partner of GrowthCap. He is the host of Great Entrepreneurs, a podcast for driven entrepreneurs and business owners. Our podcast covers all topics related to the entrepreneurial journey, from ideation to execution to optimization and to reaping the rewards of a well-run business. In the minutes ahead, we'll share with you unique insights and tactics from some of today's most accomplished and inspiring entrepreneurs.
Matt, great to be with you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
So you went to a great school, undergrad. I say that because my wife went there as well. You went to Carnegie Mellon. You did
I
your
love Pittsburgh.
Yeah, me too. And then you went to Stanford, did your PhD there, and now you're doing amazing things. We'll get into your company. Maybe to set the stage, like give us a little bit more about your background. Like, where are you from? Where did you grow up, et cetera?
So I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm a Pennsylvania boy. I went to college at Carnegie Mellon and did my degree in biology. I went to Germany to do my PhD at the University of Heidelberg. I worked at the Max Planck Institute for Medical Research there. My wife and I lived in Germany for 4 years. And then kind of throughout my exploration of science, I realized that while I appreciate reading about basic discoveries and I love science, I felt my role in the scientific process was more as a tool maker and an enabler. I liked solving problems for other scientists. And so I saw that for me to have the most possible impact, I wanted to learn to make even more sophisticated tools. So I came to the material science and engineering department at Stanford to do my postdoc, and I started working on new ways to interface with the brain. And at the time, the interest in this was brains, they're actually really interesting when you compare them to computer chips. Brains work at a much slower scale, but there are 85 billion neurons in the brain. And when they coordinate with each other, they can do really complex operations in kind of slower steps. Mm-hmm. But that also means that like if you're trying to get information out of the brain, in a computer, there's like a high-speed port, like a USB port or something you can plug into and just get it all out. But in the brain, the only way to get data out of the brain, because the brain is slow, is you have to talk to a lot of neurons simultaneously. Every neuron is slow, but if you talk to enough of them, you can get a lot of information out and understand how the brain works. So that's an issue for research when you're trying to figure out how the brain does things. It's also, though, a bottleneck for this emerging field of brain-computer interfaces, which asks the question, if we can plug into the brain and get data out of the brain, what kind of health conditions can we treat? And when I was doing my work at Stanford, I was meeting a lot of clinical researchers who were using brain-computer interfaces, devices that can read out signals from the brain to help people with paralysis, so that even though they couldn't move their bodies anymore, they could use their brain signals to control a computer or to communicate again. And I started talking with these researchers and saying like, oh, well, actually, what would it mean if we gave you next generation capabilities? What if you could have 10 times more data or 100 times more data? And the response was resoundingly that way beyond the impact that these what are called high channel recording technologies have in research, if you bring them into the clinic, you can level up the kinds of services, the kinds of therapies that you can give people with severe health conditions. And we had hit around 2015 this inflection point where built up in science labs around the world was the capability to get data out of the brain at scale, but it hadn't made it over to the clinic yet. And if someone could do that, then we could allow people who are paralyzed to be able to regain control in their lives through using a device in their brain. We could allow people who are blind or deaf to get those senses back by using a brain implant to put data into their brain directly from a camera or microphone. And then we could even start thinking about mental health in general in a really data-driven way because we have access to what's going on in the brain. So at the time, in 2015, it looked like if no one took this leap and brought this kind of technology out of the lab, that just nothing was going to happen. And so we started Paradromics. It turned out then that Elon Musk actually agreed with us that now was the time. And so a year later, he started Neuralink. A lot of money started pouring into the space. And yeah, we were the beneficiaries of a big wave of funding. And now we have a first-in-class technology platform. We're getting ready to go into our first clinical trial at the end of the year. And we're going to be helping people who have lost the ability to speak again.
Phenomenal. I mean, I think just listening to you, it's easy to see how the potential for this is almost unlimited, like in how you could apply solutions to people's health in many different ways. Curious, what did the landscape look like in terms of BCI back then when you were embarking on it? Was it completely open? Like, were there any companies existing at that time? And then what does the landscape look like today? Maybe we'll take the history first.
Absolutely. So at the time, there was a company called BlackRock Neurotech that was distributing a research device to research labs to do these incredible clinical trials to demonstrate proof of concept. But it was a device that had a lot of shortcomings with respect to longevity. It involved wires kind of coming through the scalp. It was an incredible research system, but it wasn't ready to be a therapeutic device. And the device was actually invented in 1989. So the entire clinical field of BCI was reliant on this one company that had technology from 1989, and the founders of that company who were operating it. It was making money. It wasn't a philanthropy, but the people who were doing it like in a really mission-driven way, and they were like holding up the field single-handedly for a really long time. But the field wasn't where it needed to be. And the only commercial examples that you could look for in therapeutic active implantables were things like deep brain stimulators and pacemakers that were made by these older, more established companies that, BCI wasn't even on their radar at the time. And so, yeah, I would say that we were really stepping into the breach at that time when we did that. Mm-hmm. Today, the situation is very different. There are about 10 or so BCI companies that all have slightly different BCI platforms that can do different things. Broadly speaking, I would say they break down into devices that record aggregated signals from a lot of neurons and devices that can record from individual neurons. And so in order to read out a lot of data from the brain, you can think of the brain as basically like a football stadium with, instead of 100,000 people in it, it has 85 billion people in it. If you want to know what's going on, you can drop microphones into the bleachers. And every time you drop a microphone in the bleacher, you can hear a conversation between a few people, which in the brain is a few neurons. But if you imagine taking the microphones and dropping them in the parking lot, now what you're actually listening to is the roar of the crowd. So if someone scores and everyone gets up and shouts, you'll know that something happened, but you will never be able to figure out what conversation was happening inside of the football stadium because all the voices of the stadium have been mixed together by the time they hit the microphone in a way that can't be unmixed. And what's interesting is that, and the reason that motivates Paradromics and Elon's Neuralink to build the kinds of things that we're building is that the scalability of those two things also differs a lot. Because imagine if you wanted more information from the stadium, as you start putting more microphones into the stadium, you hear more and more people, and every new microphone is more information about what's going on. But as you go into the parking lot and you put microphones in the parking lot, you just hear the same thing. Mm-hmm. And so the key to getting high data rate BCI is to put devices actually in the brain next to the neurons, put them in the bleachers of the brain and record from the individual voices of the neurons. And then that has the advantage then that it's a really scalable data platform. And the more electrodes you add, the more neurons you can record from and the more information you can get from the brain. Now, there are other devices that either sit on the surface of the brain or sit in a blood vessel or aren't in the brain at all that can get information, but they're not like the next generation modem type technology that, let's say, Paradromics or Neuralink are providing. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the lay of the land right now, is that there are two companies that are building high data rate brain-computer interface systems with the intent to open up this frontier of what can be done in BCI, and that's us and Elon's Neuralink. And there's a really big difference between our companies, primarily in where we see these devices being used. Elon wants to merge human and artificial intelligence. He wants them to be everywhere. Healthy people are going to get them, and they're going to be like cell phones. Everyone's going to replace them every 2 years. So the most important thing is reduce the barrier to entry and reduce the cost of the device. Mm-hmm. When we look at brain-computer interfaces in the next 20 years, we see that there are these really serious medical conditions that could benefit from them. And the people who are likely to undergo brain surgery to get a brain-computer interface are people with serious medical conditions. Now, that's not a niche thing. I mean, that includes single-digit million people just in the US. But when you talk to people who have, let's say, paralysis or treatment-resistant depression or blindness or PTSD, and you say, hey, I have a device that can help you. What is your expectation for this device? Their expectation is the device is going to last more than 10 years. So where Paradromics and Neuralink really diverge is the robustness that we build into our devices. Paradromics is building a 10-year plus device for medical applications that people can use for a long time. Elon is building a device that is, I don't want to say disposable, but it's a kind of planned obsolescence model, which we disagree with.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating that you're in a two-player competitive environment and the other player happens to be Elon Musk. I know you're not competing directly, but you know, you're in the same space.
One way to look at it is, of course, like to be competing against Elon is a little bit scary. We think that we're going to take different markets anyway, so it's not a big deal. But certainly, like if you're like a gold prospector and you're like showing up in the middle of the Yukon with, you know, your sieve and you're kind of going in the dirt, and all of a sudden you see like 10 meters down the stream, Elon's doing the exact same thing. That's pretty validating because Elon is traditionally pretty good at seeing where the ball is going.
So did you take it that way when you learned that he was going to go into your space? Did you take it as validating or did you take it as like, oh, geez, I really wish I didn't share information with him?
To be honest, in the beginning, when we were just a bunch of kids out of school trying to do something hard, finding out that not only are you trying to do something hard, but you're competing against Elon, that was a little bit scary. I would say like, at least my thinking has matured a lot over the last 10 years as I've realized that for every dollar that Elon invests in Neuralink, you know, he brings $2 in from his friends to invest in Neuralink, but he brings $10 in from the field to invest in other BCI companies. And so in some sense, his entering the field was a necessary condition to have 10 robust companies that are all going to go to market and become multi-billion-dollar companies. And when we talk about the markets, you know, even the near-term medical markets, we're talking $400 or $500 billion market for medical BCI, according to a Morgan Stanley report that came out last year. And I would even say that that report was a little bit conservative in terms of what kind of reimbursement they expected for these devices. So yeah, I mean, there's a ton of space to succeed here. And I think the fact that we're all building slightly different platforms and we all have different theses about how the space will develop, it's good for society because it means we have a lot of shots on goal to build this stuff. It's also good for us because it means that these kinds of companies in white space tend to diverge more often than they converge.
Now, when we talk about the need for the electrode to be within like a fraction of a millimeter of the neuron, what does this look like as a device? You know, to see it on someone's head, what would that look like?
Well, you wouldn't see it at all because the system's completely under the skin.
Okay.
It's completely invisible at the macro scale. And then at the micro scale, what it looks like is a tiny little wire that is thinner than a human hair that goes into the brain about 1.5 millimeters, and the tip of that wire is close to the neurons, and then it can record from them. I mean, I couldn't even hold one of the wires because it would be so small that it just wouldn't be picked up on the webcam. But I can show you what 421 of those wires bonded to a little piece of active electronics. This is this thing that would sit on the brain. Mm-hmm. And then it sits on the brain, and there's a wire, very flexible, that comes out of the skull. It runs under the skin, so everything is still invisible. And then there's a pacemaker type device that sits under the skin at the chest. And that is what holds the power and then sends data out through the skin via an infrared link.
Mm-hmm. And are these very fine wires only on a certain portion of the brain and a certain kind of cluster of neurons, or are they neurons like throughout the brain?
That's a great question. So the real estate of the brain is very parceled out. And so little parts of the brain do highly specific things. And so for our patients who are going to be speaking with the implant, we place the device in an area called 6V, which is a part of the motor cortex that tells the mouth and the tongue and the larynx, all of the muscles involved in speech, how to form words. And so someone like Stephen Hawking, who lost the ability to speak, in his motor cortex, whenever he tried to speak, the signals that would have directed the speech were still there. And so we can find patients like Stephen Hawking who still have the mental ability to speak, but just can't direct their body anymore. And then we can read out that activity, infer what they're trying to say, and produce the speech using a computer. But for instance, if we were giving someone the ability to control a robotic arm because they have an amputation, we would move that a few centimeters over into an area called hand knob, a different area of motor cortex that controls the hand. One of the reasons why I think understanding that like location of function is really helpful is also when you think about security and like safety. In a computer system, you always have to be careful because like one employee could mess up and like the whole system could be compromised. But in the brain, it's a lot different. In the brain, if you have a device that's in your motor cortex, it knows when you're trying to move, but it doesn't know your phone number or like know what you're thinking about your mom. And if you put a device in visual cortex, it can give pictures to your visual cortex to help you see, but it can't like pick up your arm and cause you to rob a bank or something like that. It's very localized. So just by placing it in a specific place, we know the extent to which the device can interact.
And so now you're at the stage of clinical trials, right? You're doing the CE mark in Europe currently?
We're getting ready for what's called our investigational device exemption, which is the FDA blessing our ability to do a chronic human trial in our indication of interest. And so we'll be applying for that late summer, and we're hoping to get that approval and start the trial this year.
Fantastic. So how big is the population of folks you'll work with on this?
So there are 150,000 people in the US that would meet our initial market size. And so we expect the device will ultimately be reimbursed at around $150,000 per device. So the market is, it's a modest market. It's $20 billion market, but it's one where we expect really high adoption and all across the board, like stakeholders from patients, caregivers, referring rehab doctors, implanting neurosurgeons, everyone agrees that this is the perfect use case for BCI. And so we're thinking this kind of in the terms of how like a therapeutic from biotech has a land and expand strategy, where we launch someplace where we know it's going to be successful, and then carrying off of that success, we're able to launch in new indication areas and run new trials to ultimately serve much larger groups.
And so there'd be a certain amount of training that goes into physicians who could actually be the ones to implant or do the surgical procedure.
Definitely. And not just neurosurgeons, by the way. It's also like rehab doctors. You want to educate the entire ecosystem on how to use these tools, because if you want robust adoption in the healthcare system, you have to be able to understand what everyone needs and where everyone is.
Mm-hmm. So best case scenario, when do you see having these on the market?
I think they'll be available in 2030.
Okay, fantastic. I could go on. We're running out of time. I do have a few questions. I'll ask one before my final two. Like, we have a lot of entrepreneurs tuning in. This company is much different. I mean, it just seems so daunting, like, the technology behind it and being able to kind of accomplish everything to fruition. What's been the most challenging aspect to the entrepreneurial journey so far?
I would say that creating a new category of company is particularly challenging. There are internal and external challenges. So one of the obvious external challenges is that venture capitalists, investors in general, aren't typically like deep first principles thinkers. They tend to look and they find comparables and they pattern match. And so if you're new and you're doing something for the first time and there's no one to pattern match against, that's a disadvantage. It happens to be that these kinds of companies are the ones that change the world and end up being $100 billion companies, but it also is the case that very early on, they're hard to understand. Internally, it's also difficult. I see the journey that we're going through right now being very similar to what Fairchild and early Intel went through. In the early days of semiconductor chips, there was no semiconductor industry. You had applied physicists, analog engineers, digital engineers, like mathematicians, material scientists, all coming in from these disparate areas and then trying to figure out how to make a really integrated, complex product. And they built the kind of rules of how to be a semiconductor company along the way. Right now, we're building a medical device, but we are not a medical device company. A traditional medical device startup builds a technology, and then as they transition to clinical phase, they often get rid of a lot of the engineers who built it. Then they're kind of switching to sustaining engineering and kind of like engineering support for clinical quality and regulatory. But, their goal is to build a thing and have Medtronic buy it. That's not what we are. And that's not what the promise of BCI is. brain-computer interface companies have the potential to be more like the Intels and the NVIDIAs of this next generation, where they're pipelining innovations to products and pushing the frontier. And I think doing that and figuring out how to balance that against the sort of pragmatism of, being responsible for people's lives. You can't have a software mentality when you're making a medical device. I think Reid Hoffman used to say, like, if you're not embarrassed by your first product, you shipped too late. But we can't have that attitude. Like, we don't want to have human beings in the loop to determine whether something's safe. We need to be a little more thoughtful than that. And so, I think for me, it's how do we carve that path of being an ambitious technology company that's going to be generational and is going to open up new frontiers for the world rapidly, and also understand and be respectful of the fact that we are a medical device company. People are trusting us with their lives, and we do need a certain amount of process and rigor.
I think what you're doing is incredibly inspiring. And if I could just draw on the fact that you did go to Carnegie Mellon, my wife is very involved with helping the university. What could you say about what you learned there and maybe how it's impacted you?
A lot of companies, startups and engineering companies love to hire from Carnegie Mellon. And it might not be for the reason you think. Carnegie Mellon graduates are amazing because they all have something in common, which is that they tried to get into MIT. And there are a lot of great schools. Carnegie Mellon, I think Waterloo in Canada is another amazing school that has these co-op programs where you have really smart people, but they're workers. Sometimes you get people from like Stanford and they come in and they're like doing an internship. And they come in, they're like, yeah, I'm thinking this internship's really going to be more of a strategic role. I imagine myself working directly with the CEO on like high level go-to-market strategy. And you're like, dude, I was going to let you make the coffee. I think I definitely love programs and just University of Pittsburgh, University of Michigan. There are like a lot of great salt of the earth engineering programs that produce like hard workers and are really smart. And like, so I think like when you're hiring, knowing some of those programs rather than just like looking for the Harvards or the Yales or something like that is definitely valuable.
Awesome. Okay, last two questions. One is, can you tell us about a person who has had a profound influence on you?
There are a lot. I mean, going on a sort of any successful journey, it tends to be like a series of mentors along the way that help you level up. One person I would think of for anyone who's doing kind of deep tech entrepreneurship, my thesis advisor, Andreas Schaefer. When I came into his lab, I was, for lack of a better word, arrogant. And it's like, I always knew exactly not only what I should do, but also what other people should be doing. And he was German, and he had a very nice way of just asking me clarifying questions that kind of exposed my lack of knowledge sometimes, like, oh, have you done that before? Well, no, but I was thinking about, well, do you know anyone who's done that before? Have you been involved in that? Oh, well, but I have this idea. And it's like, or did you like think through and make all the calculations? Well, no, but, and I think actually that was the first time that someone who was really, really clever also challenged me in that way. I was able to get by kind of like bullshitting up until then because either people didn't know I was bullshitting or they were just too busy to tell me and interrupt their work. I think it's really important to have those people as mentors initially when you are like sharpening yourself. And then even more importantly, then when you are in charge of a company, you need to still have those people because there are a lot of good examples of great people going off the rails because there's no one to call bullshit and there's no one to rein them in, either that because there's like a system of incentives that prevents that or just because they like push them out. That's something, if you're doing something really hard, there's a good chance that your first instinct is wrong, especially if you're high energy, high confidence entrepreneur. And so just as much as you need people who are going to amplify your energy and help you go for things, you also need people in your company who are going to be able to check you when you're wrong.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. Last question I usually ask is a charity cause or other endeavor that you're passionate about. I assume that Paradromics is all consuming. So I'm going to rephrase the question as like, what do you do outside of Paradromics that help you re-energize or recharge?
Well, I have 3 kids, so they get me engaged outside of Paradromics. I think one thing that I really appreciate, as a sort of cause that I think has suffered a little bit lately, I really appreciate long form public television, like long form radio. Yeah, kind of like slow media. Everything is so fast now, and there's such a incentive for things to come at you, like Instagram style. And if you go back and watch some programming, especially public broadcasting station from like 20 years ago, and you see kind of like the deliberate speed at which like it was developed, like Ken Burns, even Mr. Rogers, like go see how something's made with Mr. Rogers, you'll really be able to do it. Go watch Julia Child cook something, you'll actually be able to cook it. Yes, actually, I love, maybe it could be for-profit media could do that as well, but I think that there is something that enabled public broadcasting to do that kind of slow stuff.
Yeah, and maybe it takes even more talent to do it in the slow manner.
Oh, for certain. I mean, Julia Child shot all of that in like one effing take. Like, can you imagine like now, like Giada De Laurentiis has like 8 takes to like take a lasagna out of the oven. That's a lot to do it. Just like a podcast that's, raw and kind of going direct to feed is a lot more challenging to do than something that's going to be heavily edited in post.
Yeah. No, I love the long form. It's something I'd like to be able to do, but we're working on it. But Matt, I've taken up all your time. I really appreciate this. It's been a really wonderful conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.